Alright, so the next couple of movies I want to talk about are DragonHeart and Dragonslayer, which is interesting because this is actually a genre that I've never really been that big of a fan of, like stuff with like a medieval setting and stuff with like dragons and stuff like that, has just never really been my thing. I just typically kind of get bored or uninterested by stuff like that usually, but every now and then something comes through and grabs me, especially when I was a kid with these movies. I've had this interesting sort of roller coaster of feelings in regards to these two, especially with Dragonheart, because Dragonheart is a movie that I loved when I was a kid, like not long after it came out, because it played on like movie channels all the time, and my dad was always watching it. So and I think that the tone is what really caught me, and how there's actually a very sort of light tone to it, and there's a lot of comedy in it. Draco himself is often really funny, and I just watched it over and over and over again. Pretty much whenever it was on, I was watching it, and then at some point when I got a little older, maybe like in my mid to late teens, I saw it again, and I really didn't care for it. I kind of felt the way about it that I feel about a lot of like the medieval set stuff or the dragon stuff, that I'm not really that into. And that was really disappointing. But then I saw it again much later, around like, the late 20s to 30 or whatever, and somehow that feeling came back. And I felt pretty much about it the way that I felt when I was a kid. Maybe not as passionately, but I was really drawn back into it and its charm and all that stuff. Even despite the extremely dated CGI, which we'll talk about at length, it really came back to me, and I was really happy about that. Like, it's almost like I got almost a tiny piece of my soul back when I started to like this movie again. And as far as Dragonslayer goes, I don't think I was like a kid the first time I saw it. I was probably like maybe in the 12 to 13 range or something. And unlike Dragonheart, the first time I saw Dragonslayer, I didn't care for it. I was like really bored with it, and I just couldn't get into it at all. I thought there was some comedy in it that I thought seemed like really misplaced, and like maybe it was like tonally off to me or something. But as I've gotten older and I kind of came back to it, and like I kind of came back to it by accident. Like I kind of fell back into Dragon Slayer, and then something started to click when I saw it later in life as I was getting older. That was starting to actually work for me. So that's where I started with these, and so I guess the first place I'd want to start as far as comparing them would be the dragons themselves, which is really interesting because in one, the dragon is the hero, and in one, the dragon is a completely emotionless, has no other aspect in life except destruction and killing, and is the full-on villain of the story. Which is also interesting to compare because Draco obviously has a piece of the actual villain. Well, he's a piece of the actual villain's heart, with David Thewlis. So there's that sort of connection going on. But as far as the dragon being the villain and being like this, it's almost like a serial killer kind of plot or something with this dragon. And the thing about that was, I think what was so interesting about that when I first came across it, even if I didn't care for the movie, was usually, I feel like when you're a kid, the type of stuff you watch, like I was watching stuff like Dragonheart, or we see stuff like Pete's Dragon or something, like animated stuff where dragons are like usually really nice characters or good guys or something, that I didn't really know at the time at a younger age, even though it makes perfect sense, that it seems typically in dragon stories, dragons are the villains, and dragons are dangerous and deadly, and that's the way they're treated. So, yeah, that's something I didn't quite grasp the first time around, but seeing the differences between the two, where not only is Draco like a hero of the story, but the fact that he's got a voice and a personality and stuff like that, And the dragon in Dragonslayer is one that we barely really see head on at all. We just know what this dragon does and what it's capable of, and that it's completely, devoid of empathy and emotion. It's just a monster, is what it is. But like I was saying, as far as Draco still having a connection to the human villain of the story, who may or may not be just as completely lacking empathy and emotion as the dragon in Dragonslayer. So I love seeing those differences. There's also the idea of actually, before we go into some of the, I wouldn't say deeper stuff, but the themes and stuff like that. I do want to talk about the effects in these movies, actually, because that's something that's going to come up prominently when you talk about these two. And as far as, let's talk about the CGI in Dragonheart, because we were at an interesting place where CGI was just like really taking off. We were a few years after Jurassic Park, and Jurassic Park actually played a big part in Dragonheart's effects, because we saw in Jurassic Park the combination of the practical effects and the CGI and how brilliantly those could be meshed together. And obviously we were still working on CGI. Like, this was the same year as Twister and Independence Day. So, like, when you look at Twister, there's some stuff that looks amazing and there's some stuff that looks pretty shoddy. Most of Independence Day looks fucking incredible still in 2023. Independence Day's effects still look incredible. But there were also a lot of production, and we still see that today, where depending on the production, something CGI can look really, really good, or CGI can look pretty shoddy. But regardless, it does feel like stuff like Jurassic Park and Independence Day were just kind of ahead of the curve, and a lot of movies were like Dragonheart and Twister, where you can see where they, in parts where they were really getting the hang of it, and other parts where it's 1996. It's 1996 CGI, and it hasn't obviously progressed completely to what it could be. So there is a lot of scenes with Draco where he looks like a computer game. Like, the popular thing is to say like a PS2 game, but no, we're going farther back. There's a lot of scenes where Draco looks like a computer game. But still, they're doing the Jurassic Park thing, and they are combining practical effects. And there's a lot of practical effects here also that look really good. And there's a lot of combining those. Like, whenever Draco, like, comes down into water, that's actually, like, water with, like, explosives in it. That he's dropping into. And stuff like that works. Or when we have stuff like when Dennis Quaid's like going up into his mouth, and it's like there's some stuff here that's like actually well animated. Like, it doesn't look floppy like some of it does, particularly when you're dealing with like people that are CGI. But once he's inside Draco's mouth, and the inside of the mouth is practically built, where it's like you can see that there was some really cool and creative stuff going on here, and there's a lot of special features on the Blu-ray, obviously, that talk about a lot of this, where they were talking about, they were doing a lot of comparing themselves to Jurassic Park, and Jurassic Park kind of deciding what they were capable of doing. Where, not only just that, but the fact that they actually used, like, I'm not sure what you call it, like, the CGI model of the T-Rex, and then from Jurassic Park, and, like, kind of stretched it out, and that's how they created Draco, or at least the beginning forms of Draco. But they also said, for comparison, there are 6.5 minutes worth of CGI shots in Jurassic Park, and Dragonheart has 23 minutes, which is a big gap, which means there's a shitload of CGI shots in Dragonheart. Obviously, probably has to do with the fact that Draco is a main character in the story. So, seeing that, especially in like its early stages, there's still a lot to respect about the effects here, even if they don't look flawless. And it's just as fun to see like where they were kind of going around it, and they were kind of being clever about having Draco in the story, but us not always seeing him. Like, there'll be times where like we just see like his giant claw or something, or the idea of when he first comes back into the story after the prologue, and Quaid's confronting him again, the way he's like hiding behind the waterfall for a while. and we just kind of hear his voice, and he's like throwing things out, like skeletons and weapons and stuff like that. Um, but then when we do get these moments when he does come out, it's still really well done in this practical way, I guess you could say, even though it's CGI, where when Draco comes out of the waterfall, he's like struggling to take off. Like it isn't just like this sort of clean sort of glide, this sort of majestic thing happening. He does like it. You can really see where they took care in animating like the struggle of him flying and the very intricate details of that, which is really appealing. And then you've also got moments like I said, a combination of stuff, like when he flies over a building and his tail hits the roof and kind of takes a chunk of it off. You can kind of see this combining of practical and CGI. Or when he breathes fire and there's like a whole line of it, it kind of looks like the opening scene of Apocalypse Now. Maybe not that epic or anything, but it has that vibe that they do really well and combine where like when you see the real effect, you kind of forget that you just saw a CGI effect, and the way they combine and mesh together and harmonize really well. There's also, when you look at the details in like Draco's face, where like his expressions when he's kind of like denying that he knows anything about the heart, is really well done also. Where, like I said, you can acknowledge that it's 1996 CGI and it wasn't quite up to standards that, you know, like later in that year, or earlier in that year, Independence Day was setting, or what we see now. Like I said, it's still a thing today. Sometimes effects are still shit today, but it's when they're done really well, it's pretty spectacular. So as far as taking that into account and looking at Dragonslayer, I don't know near as much about the making of Dragonslayer because I haven't really seen features on it or anything. But you can tell how much of it is practical, and it's a lot. And that's another thing that's pretty incredible also, where it's like, whether it be like another thing they do that DragonHeart does is kind of like hiding the dragon in certain cases, like the opening sort of the first kill scene that he has with the girl, where like we'll just see his hand or we'll just see his tail, and it gives you the idea of the scope of this dragon before we've actually seen it. And it's, as far as like, see the gore aspect also, where like people will lose limbs, like we will see detachment of limbs, and like everything feels like it's right in there. And another thing also is the way, another thing I want to get into with Dragonslayer is like the use of location, and how like we get these really nice big wide shots, and it gives you just this idea of not just the area of like that's in danger from the dragon and that it's like under his reign, but just the journey there also kind of has this really sort of epic feel to it. And that's something that Dennis Quaid talks about with Dragonheart, was he loved the idea of work, because usually you associate CGI with green screen, and so typically when you're doing a lot of that, when you're looking at like the tennis balls and stuff like that, you're usually on a sound stage with the green screen and stuff like that. But the idea that when they made Dragonheart, they were often on actual locations while working with the CGI. So the way they were also able to combine those with the locations and sets themselves and the production design in general is also really impressive. But like I said, when you look at how much of Dragonslayer feels practical, and you can see things that you can tell are really there and really present, that's something that just kind of never goes away. And it's something that I feel like a lot of people really want to see a comeback with, is kind of lightening up the CGI a little bit. And from the sounds of it, visual effects artists may not hate that either, with the grueling processes they have to go through with CGI especially. But yeah, there's just nothing like seeing something there and actually interacting with an actor, and I'm sure it helps the actor's performance a lot also to be able to... Not, obviously, Quaid worked very well acting against practically nothing. But when you see, you know, the victims of the dragon in Dragonslayer, or Peter McNichol when he's confronting it, you get the sense that that has to sort of heighten the atmosphere on the set itself and gets more of that feeling out that should be coming out. So that's something that's always going to be great about Dragonslayer in particular. Um, and talking about the production design just in general being way off the charts, like how the sets really look like it almost looks like time traveling back to a certain era. And Dragonheart definitely pulls that off well also, but once again, there's just something that feels so lived in about all the effects and all the sets in Dragonslayer that really, build this world that it's set in, and all of that is really fantastic. And the score is also the score in Dragonheart is nice, and it's and not to downplay it or anything. It's a good score, but it does when you're thinking about the Alex North score in Dragonslayer, the Oscar nominated score. It really stands out in a really good way. Like it could have been pretty generic, which the Dragonheart has a good score, but if somebody were to label it as generic, I don't think I could really argue against that much. But there's something about Dragonslayer score that feels very sort of setting off like that sort of magical and mythical vibe without feeling generic or cliche. There's something about it that really sort of sets the mood in its particular scenes. That's really fantastic. Where this is a genre where it could be really easy to just do a sort of generic score and one that kind of typically goes with these sort of settings. But Alex North kind of really went above and beyond with his score in Dragonslayer, so that's great. Something else I want to talk about before I stop myself was the tones in these movies are very interesting, where we're looking at, light tones and dark tones, sometimes really dark tones. So I think what I was talking earlier about was one of the things I think really drew me in about Dragonheart when I was a small child was the fact that for the kind of movie that it is, like for the setting and the kind of movie that it is and in this genre, it does feel abnormally light for what it is, and I feel like that really sort of sucked me in as a child because it feels like it's that way unexpectedly. Because, I walk into the living room when I'm like 7 or 8, and my dad's watching a dragon movie with Dennis Quaid. I'm probably expecting something like... I think I almost just dismissed it as maybe something like Conan the Barbarian or something, where it's like, oh, it's, okay. And I pay no mind to it. And then this dragon is talking. This dragon is funny. And they get into funny situations. Like the moments when he fakes killing Draco a couple of times and he like dramatically falls. There's a point where he face plants when the water's too shallow. And I think one of the things that really took me in was the tone felt so unique. Like I started watching Dragonheart and it was like I didn't know movies like this existed. Like the tone is so interesting and it's kind of hard to compare it to really anything else. Because, like, obviously we're comparing it to Dragonslayer, but when you look at Dragonheart, and Dragonheart obviously has many dark moments in it, particularly with David Thewlis' character, but, Dragonslayer... Now, the thing about Dragonslayer is that I do know some people... I know there's I'm assuming many, many people, but as far as people I know, a few people where they grew up with Dragonslayer as kids. Where like in 1981, Dragonslayer is the kind of thing that was a kids movie because the 80s were fucking crazy. And you can still kind of see it that way, but when you look at Dragonheart, even though it's got dark stuff like David Thewlis taking Julie Christie into the dark and killing her, and a lot of the dark things that he does. Shooting people with arrows for sport and stuff like that. The whole Jason Isaacs character. There's dark things in Dragonheart, but at the same time, Dragonheart also gives me vibes sometimes that it could have been one of those light, live-action Disney movies from the 90s. Which is really interesting to say because Dragonslayer, as dark as it is a Disney co-production with Paramount, but, so it's like actually a Disney movie technically. But no, Dragonheart I feel like has that vibe where like it's light enough and Draco's this character. Like Draco's a character you can imagine where if he was in a Disney movie, exactly the way he is now without changing anything, he would have been like this really heavily merchandised character. And we have scenes like when, he's first flying over and Quaid's underneath him and, like, smacking into trees and stuff like that. I feel like, and I don't, this isn't an insult by any means, it might sound like it, but yeah, it feels like a live-action Disney movie from, like, the 90s. And, like I said, that's not an insult or anything. It actually brings this really sort of nostalgic feeling with it, in how light it feels for the kind of movie that it is, even what the setup is. I mean, the 90s weren't innocent. Like, they had some pretty dark shit behind their sort of lightness as well. But, like I said, there was no hiding how fucked up the 80s were in this really great way that a lot of us probably miss. Where it's like, what happened to scaring kids with PG movies? Let's do that again. What happened to scaring kids with Disney movies? Let's do that again. Now we just emotionally traumatize them, but it's emotionally, but that's... Yeah, as far as, another thing that these two movies tend to tackle is impending death. Um, where something that I really like about the Draco character is, while he is funny, there's also this impending death throughout it that he recognizes. And we were talking about the way dragons have been used in lighter material before, and especially in stuff we see as kids. And so it's like, to watch Dragonheart and see a dragon talking about, I long for death, but I also fear it, I think is what his line is. And it's like, to see a dragon aware of its own incoming death is surprisingly serious for a movie that sets up a light enough tone. But another thing about impending death is we have the incredible Ralph Richardson shows up in Dragonslayer at the beginning and the end. And he's another character that's kind of surrounded by this idea that the character, for the story to progress, this character will not make it. But the way he comes in, and his death scene in particular also, where he's got this, when he's stabbed, when he thinks he can't be, it's interesting how much the movie falls into a sort of reality for a minute, like as far as like emotion, like this reality where we feel this stab just based on the reaction of Peter McNichol. Like, we don't actually really see it happen. Like, Tyrion even kind of maneuvers himself to make sure the camera from the Disney co-production here doesn't actually see his knife go in. But still, the way they play it, where everything goes silent. Like, there's no big musical cue. There's no, Peter McNichol screaming out. He just kind of internalizes having seen that, and kind of knowing it was inevitable because he was trying to stop it from happening. But then, yeah, all you see is Richardson realizing he is mortal, and you hear the sound of the wind. And there's something about that feels really... Like I said, it's almost like the movie grinds to a sort of reality for a minute, which is really well done. And like I said, really shows the gravity of what's going on here, because, I mean, we do talk about that, but there's also... When we talk about the dragon in this basically being a stone-cold killer and nothing else, and not knowing anything else, this first girl that gets killed... The way they set up the hopelessness of what this dragon causes and the way that he kills them. But as far as the hopelessness goes, it's like, yeah, they're basically sacrificed and they're chained there, and that's just what it is. And that's usually where this scene would go if it's just an introductory scene. This scene is just, this is what they do and this is how the dragon does it. This is what our threat is. This is what we have to stop. Because this is going to happen to everyone. So... she's chained up, but they give us this moment where we think she's going to get away because she gets out and she escapes, seemingly. But then the way she eventually... And it's kind of a long scene to introduce this, because once she's out of the chains, it seems like, oh, maybe she'll get away, and then when she gets away, she'll be a major character or something. But no, we watch her... get chased and then get cornered, and then the fire comes down, and like I said, it really sets up this hopeless vibe of, even if you feel like you've escaped, you probably haven't, and that's how hardcore this dragon is. So I said those are some interesting tones to juggle because Dragonslayer does have comedy in it also. It has its own sort of interesting Disney vibe to it also. Where I talked about Dragonheart feels like it'd be a '90s live action Disney movie. There's this moment at the beginning after Ralph Richardson's character has died the first time that he dies, and Galen realizes that he's going to go off with Hodge to, track down Valerian again, and then they're going to kill the dragon. And when it's he and Hodge just sort of walking through the woods, and they banter, and they do this whole thing. He does the thing where he like strips him of his cloak and then puts it back on. He's playing with the magic and stuff like that. That feels like something that would have been in like an animated Disney movie in like the 80s. Like imagine that scene animated like the way Disney was doing movies in the 80s. Like the stuff when stuff like The Black Cauldron was coming out. And that scene fits perfectly in that. You can perfectly see that scene animated as a Disney movie. Peter McNichol's voice even fits the character. But yeah, so there's a lot of tone juggling going on here, and it is interesting. Like I said, Dragonheart has that nostalgic factor of the lighter movies that we watched when we were kids, and Dragonslayer kind of has the nostalgia of the darker movies that we feel like they don't really make that way anymore, unless they become a PG-13 movie, and then they're kind of this intended middle ground. But it brings back that idea of movies that feel like they were sort of made for kids, but they weren't afraid to make them like super dark and show kids like some really hardcore shit and show them like death and people anticipating death and all that other stuff. Characters that we think might live don't, because that girl at the beginning is not the only one that happens to. So I guess something else we can talk about is the characters. Starting with our main characters here with Dennis Quaid and Peter McNichol. What's really interesting, you can say this about both of them, but I feel like it especially fits Dennis Quaid in this movie. And that is, we were talking about how great the sets are, and how it's like it feels like you could time travel, and that's more or less what you'd see. I genuinely feel like, if you were to like time travel to the time that Dragonheart is set, it's very believable you'd run into somebody that looks and acts exactly like Dennis Quaid in Dragonheart. Where Quaid just kind of like feels of the era. And where it's like it's a case of perfect casting and the way he played it, where he has like that sort of gruff nature to him, but there's also enough humanity in him that he feels like a real person and not just like a sort of storybook hero that they could have set up. And McNichol's kind of the same way. Peter McNichol's one of those people where it's like, I feel like you could time travel to any era between the last 1,000 years and today, and you'll find somebody that looks like Peter McNichol and acts like Peter McNichol. But the way that they do set up Quaid as like this sort of brutish character, McNichol's the kind of character that uses like his wits, and he's like resourceful, and it's just as believable he could slay a dragon as somebody with, the strength and gruffness of Quaid that he has. So I feel like they're both really strong lead characters in different ways. And as far as like the way their sort of love angles come from, I actually kind of like the way, and this is very unusual actually, especially for me to feel this way. The way they handle this, I would call it a love triangle, but what the movie does really well, we're talking about Dragonslayer, and we're talking about Galen and Valerian and the princess, where I would call it a love triangle, but what's great about it is the movie never really treats it that way. Where, there's obviously going to be some attraction to the princess, but they set up well enough that Galen is clearly attracted to Valerian, and there's something going on there. So when we get to the scene where Valerian says, like, you're in love, aren't you? And she thinks it's the princess. There's something that's not annoying about that scene that I feel like would be in another movie, because they've established the characters surprisingly well in this. There's times where Dragonslayer takes its time, and I feel like that can be a problem sometimes, where sometimes it feels like Dragonslayer will reach a point, and then it'll kind of go in circles for a little bit, and then move on, and then do that again. But at the end of the day, it does work for the characters, it turns out. Because in this scene where Galen confesses his love to Valerian and says, like, no, it's not the princess, we actually do feel something for Valerian there, and it's not just oh, here's the part where the movie has the love story that we don't really care about, usually. But I don't know, I really like the characters in Dragonslayer, especially the way they set up the princess, given her fate. Because there's the thing where we're building up to the point where the princess is going to get called in the lottery. And the way they set up this scene so well is they build up very convincingly that we're going to think it's Valerian that's about to get called, and there's going to be some big moment here where she has to be the one that goes into the climax or potentially gets killed. And it ends up being the princess who is basically sacrificing herself and kind of, going against the rich benefiting from everything, and where you're at in society you benefit, and how the rich never have to partake. It's always the poor that are being sacrificed to the dragon. And so when it actually is the princess, that's one thing in itself. The fact that the princess does go out and get killed, and especially since it's such a noble sacrifice, I remember being very surprised by the first time I saw the movie. And honestly, it kind of still surprises me when I watch it back now. And I think it's not just that they went the route of killing the princess after she was so noble, but that we see the baby dragons gnawing on her body, and that's the limb detachment I was talking about earlier, where they gnaw her at the ankle and pull her foot off, and we see that happen. And it's like, this is the last character you expected to see that with. And that's... Yeah, usually when characters like that have a turnaround, it's still from their safe tower. But the fact that the princess came down from the tower, went into the cave, and knowingly got killed, and we saw her body torn apart, Jesus Christ. It's insane. But it really does a great job of setting up the stakes and what they are and how nobody is safe. So I feel like they really set those characters up really well. And as far as Dina Meyer goes in DragonHeart, she is a character that does feel more like she's in line with a typical script. Like, I feel like they don't take as many liberties with her as they do with the characters in Dragonslayer. But Dina Meyer still has particular strengths as an actress that she's able to do, particularly the sort of holding her own, especially when she's surrounded by tough characters. We saw that specifically in Starship Troopers. It's interesting. I've started to hear more, as time goes on, the same sentiment about Starship Troopers, which was, in the 90s when it came out, everybody had their eyes on Denise Richards, and now it's kind of turned on... Dina Meyer was the real female star of Starship Troopers. And that kind of carries over... No, it carried over in Starship Troopers from here, because this was the year before. So... Yeah, and then as far as, like, side characters go, we get a nice comedic side character with Pete Postlethwaite in Dragonheart, who was very good at comedic side characters despite having a pretty serious nature in a lot of his other roles and some of his more famous roles. But he plays the comedy relief very well. And Jason Isaacs, I mentioned as the henchman, is very effective. But as far as... Well, also as far as side characters in Dragonslayer, there's Tyrion, who's kind of like the main villain as far as humans go, I guess, unless you count the king. But the way they set him up he kills Ralph Richardson at the beginning, and you would think, oh, that establishes him as, a formidable villain. But then he kills Hodge, too, and we set up like Hodge is going to be on the journey with Galen for most of the movie. And that he's going to be a crucial character. And so that he dies so early by Tyrion's hand also really sets up... Like, they set up the stakes with the dragon well enough. They set up the stakes with Tyrion really well, too. So that was really well done. And there is a brief but very epic performance from Ian McDiarmid in Dragonslayer as well. Where obviously he's most well known for playing the Emperor. And obviously he's one of the best, movie villains of all time. But, if you haven't seen Ian McDiarmid do Shakespeare, I would look up videos of that. Where like he played like the Porter in Ian McKellen's Macbeth, and he was part of that whole theater group, that Shakespeare group, and he is a phenomenal actor, and he will ham it up like nobody's business in the best way. And what little time he gets in Dragonslayer, he does that as well, and it's really fantastic. But somebody we kind of touched on was Einon, the David Thewlis character in Dragonheart, who is also the main villain of this story, where there's not a villainous dragon in Dragonheart, so we need a character that matches that. And David Thewlis does play that very well. There's the sort of obvious foreshadowing where the opening of the movie is him training the young Einon, and it's the two of them fighting, and we know how this is going to probably come to fruition as the movie comes to its climax. It's going to return, but have a much different context. And we get this moment immediately where we also talked about how he kills his own mother, and after his mother has said, "I saved a creature not worth saving," and we've seen him kill Dana Meyer's father, where he's just shooting arrows at people for sport and stuff like that. Very Ralph Fiennes qualities of him. And we just see that cruelty. But another vibe here that kind of carries over from both movies is power and what comes from that. And, being sort of power hungry, and how the rich and the powerful can sort of take over and keep things in their benefit when people are literally being slaughtered, whether it's the king himself who's doing the slaughtering or an unstoppable creature that's doing it. The rich will always thrive. So when we see this power-hungry nature in Einon, when his father, the king, is dying, and he's snatching the crown from him, basically telling him to hurry up and die so he can just take the crown from him, really sets him up to be the kind of character that he is, this very just sort of wretched, villainous character. And something where even in his young age we can see what he's going to become. And I love also the way they set up how he and Draco are connected through the heart, where there's the moment where he has Dana Meyer captive and she stabs him, but we don't see that moment. We see it's just this nice conversation going on between Draco and Quaid, and then Draco reacts to it. I thought was a really cool and clever way to not only do that, but also show off the concept of what's going on here and their connection. So it's... Yeah, I think that's... And as far as, being power-hungry and stuff like that, and the rich benefiting, we did talk about the poor being sacrificed in Dragonslayer, and it's and it doesn't feel like it's, beating you over the head with some message. It's just this is what it is, and this is where the powerful are in this world. And it really sets up these human villains in the story when you take dragons completely out of the equation and creatures completely out of the situation. Where, like Julie Christie says, where she refers to Einon just as a creature. And how it's the age-old cliche of humans are worse than humans are the monsters, or they're worse than monsters, whatever it may be. And yeah, it's a theme, but it's not, trying to be too much of the movies. The movies still have a lot of adventure in them and fun in them, and then eventually we are going to get to our endings, both of which are quite bittersweet, surprisingly bittersweet for both of them. Where what I love about Einon being such a, terrible, horrible villain is that when he does finally die, I love the fact that because of this connection he has with Draco, it's basically Einon's death is an afterthought. Because there's this beautiful sequence where Draco does die, and, he becomes the stars and stuff like that. And the fact that Draco is the focus of that moment, it's just what Einon deserves for his death to be an afterthought, and for this to be this sort of bittersweet moment of Draco, passing on or whatever. And as far as Dragonslayer goes, it actually does feel like it really fits the dark tone of everything, and almost the cynical tone of everything. Actually, there's no almost about it. The cynical tone of everything. We were just talking about this with the Power Hungry. Where there's no heroic ending for our heroes. We have Galen and we have Valerian, and they're off to the side after having slayed this dragon. Ralph Richardson has to come back, and it's a whole other sacrifice moment it's this, like I said, as far as, Galen knowing when to be resourceful and knowing what to do and using his wits, and then having this reunion with Ralph Richardson and everything. It's this fantastic, explosive ending and a fantastic end to this dragon, and so triumphant. And it's triumphant until it's not. Where they're off on the sidelines and the king comes waltzing in, sticks a sword in it, and that's it. No credit whatsoever, no heroic thing, no, cheering on anybody's shoulders or anything like that. It's just, well, I guess we go. I guess we walk away with no fanfare. But then he does make the horse appear, and it's like, well, that's okay. So Galen does have the power and stuff like that. So, like I said, it does a great way of like kind of honing its cynicism a little bit and giving us endings that aren't complete. Like they still feel like endings and like triumphant endings in their own way. Just not a triumphant ending in the way we typically see it. And the fact that both movies feel like they kind of take that route is really impressive. So that's pretty much how I feel about these. If I had to pick one, I'm more likely to rewatch Dragonheart. I don't know. I don't think it's just the darkness the Dragonslayer has, where it's not as light, and it doesn't have as much of the nostalgic factor because I saw Dragonheart at a much younger age. I don't think it's much of that. I do feel like Dragonheart might be more fun, and Dragonheart feels like it's more to the point. Where, like I said, Dragonslayer does have moments where it'll reach a point and then it kind of walks in circles and meanders, and it does that, a few times. We even get like two different climaxes. Like it feels like we have a climax, and then there's the whole thing of bringing Ralph Richardson back. Like there's a reason that's the way it is, but you kind of feel it, like it's kind of walking in circles sometimes. As impressive as the movie is as a whole overall, like I hate to say that or say anything down about it or anything, but because they're both very impressively well made. I would say Dragonslayer might almost... I really struggle to use the word objectively better, but as far as a production standpoint, Dragonslayer is just phenomenal across the board as far as effects and production values and stuff like that. Like I said, Dragonheart, struggles with CGI sometimes, but we were also in a very experimental period, and we were figuring things out, and we were, on the back of Jurassic Park was, 3 years before, but still, it's a movie that's going to be in Jurassic Park's shadow, using effects the way that it does. But I feel like it's still, I'm so glad that I eventually came back around on it, and so, yes, this movie does bring me joy. Maybe not in the same way that Dragonslayer does, but they both do in a way. But like I said, I'm more likely to rewatch Dragonheart if given the choice. So that's probably where I land, but both are of great quality. So that's going to be the end of this. I think the next thing is going to be the next movie club, which is Children of Men, and then we have a Q&A after that, and then we're going to come back into me doing more stuff, whether it be this Versus or the new segment or other things. So still a whole lot of stuff is coming. So until the next thing, I think that's it.